Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we interview experts from around the world on presentation skills, how to be heard, how to be visible, and how to deal with the communication challenges, whether it's inside a meeting or on a stage or on a Zoom call. My guest today is Rebecca Linquist, who is a speech, accent, and voice coach. And we're going to be talking about how do you make yourself understood and heard? Rebecca is a speech, voice, and accent coach who specializes in helping foreign-born executives and non-native speakers of American English bridge the gap to bridge basically the accent gap to become dynamic, authentic, and inspired communicators and excel in their field of choice in the global arena. One of the things that's interesting about Rebecca is I do a great deal of work with people on how to speak clearly and be understood, because if people can't understand you, they will tune you out. But working on accent reduction, working on speaking clearly in another language is an art unto itself. There's a great deal of physicality involved, and that's where I will usually send people to an accent reduction coach like Rebecca. One of the things that Rebecca has done recently is she has authored the book American English, which lays out not just how do you pronounce this vowel and this word, but also why American English has become the business standard. She's, as an author, a senior manager, an educator, and a trainer, and a public speaker in a variety of roles, and has coached executives in Silicon Valley for the last 20 years. So we went a little bit into the politics and the details of language. I'm a word geek. So, for me, this was really fun to go in and talk about how words are done and why do you pronounce something that way, et cetera. It's fascinating, the techniques and the tools of how you communicate. So here we go to the interview with Rebecca Linquist. Hello, Rebecca Linquist. I am so happy to have you as a guest on Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here. And it's so much fun to be talking about language and accents because I am a total language geek. So, and you have a wonderful book called American Speak, which is full of all sorts of insights that I love. And I'm really excited to ask you about that. I'll try not to go too much into the woods of diction, although I think the two of us could probably geek out for a while. But before we begin, I'd like to ask you the question I ask everybody, which is, if you were to share the stage with someone who's no longer with us, who would it be? Who would you like to interview? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
That's a great question. I think for me, the person that I would love to be in the room with, whether it's an interview or a dinner, would be Robin Williams. I feel that he added so much to our lives, not only as an actor, as a comedian, as a person, and just to have that gift of gab. I think so many people wish they could just express themselves and not monitor what they say. and not be afraid to say things that maybe are just off the cuff. And he was someone who could say anything. And he could do different accents. He was a master of dialects. He had a tremendous amount of talent. And although many people appreciated him, I don't think he was appreciated enough.
What would you ask him?
I might ask him to do some of those dialects, because I can tell you as a coach, I talk to a lot of people who speak different languages, and it's useful for me to be able to emulate what they're doing, because often they can't hear the difference. So they know they're doing something different. Technically, you can tell them you're making your R differently, for example, but they can't really do what I'm doing, and I can't do what they're doing. So I think I would ask Robin if he could give some of those, like, let's do a Scottish accent. And there are many accents of Scotland, but to be able to do various English accents, British accents, to do a French person speaking English, to do a German person speaking English, it could be interesting to hear him and see how he does it on the fly, with almost without preparation or thought.
Oh, that would be so much fun. I love that. And one of the things that one of the reasons why I wanted to interview you was because you and I are both in the business of helping people be heard and understood in business, and how you speak is so important. And what I really loved about your book is American speak. Why is American speak the language we should be able to communicate in?
It's a great question. I think many people don't think about the fact that although English is a world language, we all speak it differently all over the world. People in China, India, every country of the world, we all speak English. We use it as a lingua franca, which is a common language people use to communicate in business or politics. We use it for that. It used to be French back in the 17th century, which I talk about in the book. So it's very useful to have a lingua franca. The problem is we seem to have standardized on British English, which sounds okay if we all standardized on that. However, first of all, most of us don't know we're speaking British English. And when I say British English, that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. I'm not talking about a specific dialect of British English. There are many. But simply British vowels are articulated, for example, quite differently from American vowels. We tend to use our jaw, and we have these long, lax sounds. And how that can show up for an American watching a British film, which I've done on occasion. And when I'm watching it, I find that I have to keep stopping and replaying it because it's coming at me too fast. Not because I don't understand the words. I usually get it the second or third time, but it's coming at me so fast that I'm not really hearing it. And that's a commonality non-native speakers deal with. They're often told that they speak too fast, and they often ask me, how do I slow myself down? And they attempt to talk more slowly. So speaking British English, it contributes to these issues a lot around tension, because there's tension to create the lip sounds of a British accent. There's less tension in an American accent, although many of us still have jaw issues. TMJ is universal. However, allowing the jaw to drop and having a more relaxed modality of speech in all your vowels allows you to be more well understood. So what I put forth in the book is maybe speaking American English might be an easier way for people to communicate. That's one side of it. And the other side of it is a lot of people use American English as a standard, such as aviation, technology. There are already areas where people use American English as the standard.
Are you saying that basically the pace of British English is naturally faster than the pace of American English?
I believe so. And what's most noticeable in that pace is the pitch change. So the British, along with other accents that are out there, like, for example, Indian speakers, tend to have a lot of pitch change inside of vowels.
A lot of melody.
A melody inside the vowel. So I can't do all of those accents. I can show you in a Southern, and this is kind of a fake Southern accent, but if I talk like that, I'm changing pitch within my vowel. My vowel is changing pitch. Whereas in a standard dialect, we tend to go longer and flatter, which is why I use a band when I teach American English, we tend to go longer and flatter for that more neutral accent that you might hear on television or from a newscaster, for example.
Well, there was something you said in the book, which I thought, oh, duh, why did I never figure this one out? Is that it's not so much about slowing down the way you speak as elongating the vowels. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that's hard for someone who hasn't grown up speaking standard American English?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the main things that I teach. And that is most languages of the world, I would say almost all languages of the world, are syllable timed. Not every language has syllables, so it might be fora timed or whatever they divide their language into. But the idea is that every element of their language is about the same length. So in most languages, if you were to speak, the band would move like this. As you speak, everything would be equal length. And you notice as I'm emulating this in English, I'm speeding up a little bit.
Okay.
Because I'm emulating equal length syllables. In American English, only some of the syllables are a little bit longer. And that's slowing me down just by doing that. Of course, you have to know which words to make longer, how to do it, where to do it, when to do it. And that's part of the learning. So it is about making vowels longer, but it's a little more complex. It's also about which syllables are longer, which words are longer, and how to do it naturally, even without the band.
So listeners, if you are listening to the audio version of this, I urge you to go back and look up the video. You can find us on YouTube because she has just shown us something that has been so useful. Excellent. So Rebecca, sorry, keep going.
Sure. So syllable length is really key. And I like to call it syllables instead of vowels only because there are vowels in unstressed syllables. So what I mean by that is a commonly mispronounced word is the word development. And I think there are a couple of reasons that could be mispronounced, partly because in some parts of the world, it's pronounced differently. It's not wrong. That's the way they say it. But in American English, we have to have one primary syllable that's always longer. So in the word development, it's that second syllable. And not only is it that you have to know which syllable to stress, you have to have enough breath to be able to stress it without anxiety, stress, without your throat seizing. So one of the first things I notice in non-native speakers is the throat does this. You could see the seizing and the squeezing of the muscles when they try to elongate a syllable because they're not used to doing that. So part of it is knowing to stretch the syllable. Part of it is knowing which syllables in which words and where, how to make a good choice when you're speaking without having to think about it too much. And then how not to seize here, how to breathe and allow the sounds to get longer.
You know, it's one of the things that I've often been interested in. When I was first learning Italian, I noticed that in Italian, usually it's the second to last syllable that is emphasized. And although sometimes there are words where it's the third to last syllable, and you just have to learn the exceptions. And that is often the case in English, American English at least. So that I wonder how much that the Italian immigrants shaped the way English is spoken in America. For instance, when I went to Japan, so I studied Japanese for a while in the 1980s, and I had a sister who lived there for 3 years, and I was going to learn Japan, darn it, which I didn't get terribly far, but I could say things. I just couldn't always understand what they answered because I only had 5 verbs. But for instance, there's a famous town called Kamakura, and Americans will say Kamakura, or let's say Hiroshima. Americans will say Hiroshima because we're used to stressing the second to last syllable, but the Japanese will say Hiroshima. And I realized in reading your book that I was probably Americanizing Hiroshima, and it's probably more even when it's actually spoken in Japanese.
Absolutely. And the Japanese words I love to use with all people, because we all eat Japanese food at some point, or at least try it. And those are words like sushi, because most Americans feel comfortable saying sushi. We have to shorten one of the syllables to say it. And even more noticeable, if you order just the raw fish, sashimi, which a Japanese person tells me I'm a little closer when I say sashimi with equal length.
This is useful to know, though. If you are listening to this going, what on earth are they talking about? The reason why this matters is because if you are communicating and people cannot hear you, they cannot understand you, then they'll tune you out. And they'll make value judgments about whether you are worth listening to or not. So one of the things I do with my clients often is if they have an accent, I will work with them on getting the key phrases understandable. Or, a Japanese client, I worked out an elevator pitch for her that had no R's and no L's because she just could not do it. I'm wondering how you would approach that, of making sure that your key phrases are understandable.
So I definitely think at times I'm given a client who doesn't really have enough time to work with me. They tell me they have a keynote speech and they're giving it tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
In that case, I totally understand working with the band and hitting the key phrases. But if you're avoiding every L and every R, which I know some people are, then I think it's important to figure out what's going on there. If it's early childhood learning, sometimes you can learn by using devices, not only the band, I also use a rubber band for breath. So in other words, if you have a sound like breath, the TH sound will cause the tissue to move. If it's not moving, you're not really projecting the TH. You might be saying Brett, like the man's name. So if you said, for example, Brett has bad breath, you can see the movement. Tools you can use. I would certainly revisit with a Japanese client all those L's and R's, because we tend to lump them together as I have a problem with L and R. We don't really realize that there are light and dark L's, and there is an R in combination with an L before or after. So with most of my Japanese clients, I find that there are certain words they can't say well. There are other L's and R's that they can say quite well. And it's learning which ones are challenging in which combinations. And it's different for everybody depending on when the brain learned those sounds. We often call it fossilization, where there's certain sounds that they can't say. So while it may be useful in the short term to simply work on key phrases, I think it's important, if your goal is to become a communicator, to really address those challenges and go there and figure out what's going on for you. Everyone's different.
I would absolutely say, learning to speak clearly is an art in itself. So this is not something that I teach specifically. If there was someone who has a really thick accent but needs to be understood in English, I would send them to Rebeca, absolutely, for that kind of training. Mostly what I'm doing is in the context of a presentation. You're giving a speech at a conference. I had a Vietnamese client, for instance, who spoke very fast. And she spoke very fast and very choppy. And we spent a lot of time getting her key phrases to slow her down, because she was going to do a big speech at a big, very visible event, and getting her to slow down on the key places. I had not read you hadn't written your book yet, Rebecca. If you'd written your book a couple of years ago, I probably could have helped her better. Let me ask you about articulation. Sometimes we talk about enunciation or just speaking clearly. That sounds like that's one of the main tools that you use, right?
I think it's extremely important. So some people want to work on their speech in order to fit in with the community, for a variety of reasons. Other people want to work on diction and clarity. And some people aren't even aware that they're mispronouncing words. So I think there's a whole range out there, but definitely diction, I think there are a couple of areas that affect it. One of them is the muscle movement. So for example, if you can't lift your lip and show your front teeth, I've actually had clients ask me, why do Americans show their front teeth so much? We actually do that because it's part of our articulation pattern. If you drop your lip and talk like this, do you hear how immediately I sound more muffled or mumbly?
Mm-hmm.
But I might not sound that way if I was speaking Tamil or Gujarati or some other language. That might sound great. So learning to use the muscles differently, I think, is a big piece of diction. And also what you were saying earlier about someone sounding really abrupt or talking really fast in an abrupt way, it can be a carryover pattern from another language that can be addressed through breath patterns. I like to call it body energies. They address this in the Lessix method, where they talk about being radiant, like jumping in, or being buoyant, which is more like a breathy quality, or there's a third quality. So there's buoyant, there's the radiance, and I can't think of the third quality at the moment.
Who is this? Who's talking about this?
The Lessig method. And I just remembered it. Lessig, Lessac, Lessig. Arthur Lessig passed away, but he wrote some beautiful books on body dynamics. It was one of my favorites. A lot of them are out of print, but one is used in colleges all over the US. So you have to get a PDF of it, or maybe it's a Kindle by now. This was pre-Kindle days.
We'll put a link in the show notes. Yeah.
Awesome. The third one is potency. So potency makes your voice stronger.
Which means power.
Strength. And it comes from that low abdominal area. So I'm getting a little throaty and a little more powerful now. For me, I also use the Alexander technique. I'm kind of eclectic. And right now what I'm doing is accessing my pelvic floor. So when I breathe and access the pelvic floor, my pitch tends to drop a bit. You could probably do it without dropping your pitch as much, but it does give you more of a potent sound if that's what you're after.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Europe. I live half the year in the Austrian Alps, where the local dialect is very much in the back of the throat. And one of the things that an American friend who lives there told me is that you need to moving the voice to the front of speaking through the mask, sort of the bones around your nose and cheeks. It helps to smile. And Americans have learned how to do that because we're taught to smile. And the bit you were saying about showing the teeth as part of the articulation pattern, I'm very aware of how I'm smiling now. So I have to not look at my face here. I'm going to notice the way I'm doing that. Very interesting. How do you deal with somebody who grew up in a language that is produced in the back of the throat, for instance?
So I think awareness is the first step. And I just had a client ask me that this morning. Is it awareness, or is it learning to use muscles differently? And I think it's both. You can't change it if you're not aware you're doing it. Right. So spending a lot of time in the awareness phase, there are different ways to speak in the back of your throat. So I was actually working with a man from India who was speaking like this and almost sounding mafioso. It was terrifying kind of sound could be terrifying, versus just speaking from the back, like originating sounds in the back, it sounds more like thinking about. You could originate sounds in the back. So it's becoming aware of exactly how you're articulating from a variety of different perspectives, which muscles you're using, how you're breathing. That's a whole process in itself. And what I notice is most people want to jump to the solution. So they want to immediately start speaking with an American accent. Teach me the vowels, teach me how to do it. They don't want to spend a lot of time noticing what they already do and how they could migrate it or change it slightly, which would actually behoove them. Because just changing things maybe 10% is really a more natural way of sounding, not trying to sound American, but just changing how you do things slightly. And so learning to speak, I teach back of the mouth breathing, which actually, I learned this from some opera singers, and I believe you have an opera background. So
yes, indeed.
This was actually the Joe Estel method, which was designed by a speech pathologist, but now taught by opera singers all over the world and others. And one of the exercises they had us do in the class was to open your mouth and laugh in the back, obnoxiously, like this. Now, when we do that, we tend to squeeze the back of our neck, which I learned from the Alexander method is something we don't want to do. So the challenge is, how do you teach this over Zoom? So what I've found, because I've done this with hundreds of people now, is that when you release the back of the neck, if you put your hand here, you can feel the squeeze happening and your eyes go up. So the minute someone does this, I know that they're actually squeezing the back of their neck, the nape of it. So the idea is to release the back of the neck. Your hand can be here as a cue, eyes are forward, and then you drop the jaw and laugh. Without squeezing. And the breath doesn't stop at that point.
One of the things that people forget is that speaking is a physical act. You have to actually train the muscles of your breath muscles. You have to train your lips and teeth and tongue to actually say things that are unusual. When I think about how long it took me to be able to rattle off international opera director and presentation skills trainer, I had to train my lips and tongue to say that. And so that's really it's a thing to remember, that this is actually a physical act, and therefore it is worth practicing just as you practice anything that your body has to do. Another question I had, you have a whole, a thing that you mentioned in your book about figuring out the difference between your native language and American English. If you can't hear it, it's sort of like being able to hear and repeat music. I think that's what Robin Williams does. He was a great mimic. If you can learn by ear, and there are a lot of people who can't do that. But you had something about speaking in a fake American accent.
Yes.
I thought that was a brilliant technique. Give us this tip. How can we use this? I thought it was brilliant.
I love this tip. Actually, it's not mine. This tip came from the acting community. I took a class with actors. So I tried every technique before I did my own stuff. And what they teach actors is, of course, you don't have a lot of time to learn a new accent. You can't spend the next 10 years. Maybe you have a role starting next month. So what you do is you get a text, for example, in your language. You could do it with any language, but a text is always kind of nice. And you read it aloud as if you're an American learning the language. So I have a text in front of me in Japanese or Hebrew or French or whatever the language that the person speaks is. And as I speak my own native tongue, I read it with a perceived American accent.
Oh, Tannenbaum, wie choice in deine Blätter. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's really useful because for whatever reason, the brain is better able to hear the accent in your native tongue and fake it than it is to learn another language in the native accent, to actually speak your own language and hear that foreignness to it and emulate it. And then whatever they're doing when they do it, I find the things that sound very American, the things they're doing well. And I say, that sound you just made, can you put that in this American word? And sometimes they say it correctly for the first time, just after the exercise.
Wow, this is amazing. This is amazing. And there was one other thing I wanted to ask you about. So I grew up with languages. I started speaking French when I was in grade school. And then when I spent 30 years in the opera community, there's sort of an embarrassment about the American R. Somehow the British R or the Italian R is, the Italian R, even singers who are singing in French, which has the R at the back of the throat, will, in order to sing, you move the R to the front of the mouth so that you can understand it. And the joke always is the American who's got this horrible big R in the back of it, but you like the American R. So I had 30 years of being embarrassed about having an American R. Talk to me about why you have a whole chapter about the letter R.
Great question, and wonderful thing to think about. There's a lot of subjectivity around accents, whether they're strong or not. And I have some examples in the book of one person thinks it's strong from their perspective, someone else doesn't. We all have different R sounds, or we have no R sound at all in some languages, which makes it more challenging. I think that not having an R sound at all in your first language is a problem, because so many of our words have R's in them that intelligibility will suffer. But if, for example, you have an Indian R, a French R, an Italian R, it can sound beautiful to people. And often someone will say that you have a gorgeous accent, don't change it. So there's this question of, well, do I need to work on it or not? And I would argue that if you work on your vowels, and there's a lot of clarity in your vowels and your syllable length, which we talked about earlier with the band, syllable length, then you could go ahead and use your R from your first language if it works for you. And it does work for some people. Downside to doing that is that if I'm using a different R, it's probably made in a different location in my mouth that the American sounds are not made in. We make our R the way we do for a reason. Our resting position is in the middle of our mouth. And you can test that by making a hesitation sound. So if you're hesitating in American English, you end up with in every language. Some people say if you're saying something different when you hesitate, that tells you where your resting position is. And if your resting position is in the front and you're making an R in the front, which a lot of people are, then you're going to get really tired all day and a stiff jaw potentially by pulling your tongue back to make vowels and then pulling it forward. So you're pulling it back to say up, which is our schwa sound, and then pulling it forward to go rrr. You might want to make, your nice trilled R. That could make you very tired and even give you a headache by the end of the day. And I share some of those experiences in the book as well.
Well, Rebecca, this has been awesome, amazing, exciting. There is so much that's really important about how we produce language that people can hear. The whole idea is to be understood. And because if people can't understand you, they just tune you out. So this is a really important tool. How can we find out more about you?
Definitely my website is the best place, englishbythehour.com. That's where I put all my documentation and links to
englishbythehour.com. Yes.
That's probably the best source. The other one would be my YouTube channel. And you can just type in my name, Rebecca Lindquist, without a D. So Lindquist, the linguist, is how you can remember me. And I have about over 100 free videos on YouTube.
I would think that the videos would be incredibly important so that you can get an idea. There's so much more that you actually have to hear and try that is fascinating. Thank you so very much. The other thing I would say is if you really have a thick accent, this is a very important investment for your career to make sure that people can hear you. So work with someone like Rebecca to really get the clarity of language so that people can really understand you. And then once they understand you, then you can make an impact. So thank you so much, Rebecca Linquist. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but so much fun to talk about language and how language works. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. Before we go, let me remind you that if you are interested in finding out how presentation skills can help your career, go to our free assessment, speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And there you could see where you are strong and where you might need to improve your presentation skills in order to get the results that you want. This has been Elizabeth Bachman. Thank you so much, Rebecca Lindquist, and I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.